Right, here we are. Welcome all. We are here for seminar number 14. We're still with the Philokalia. All right, we're in the 2nd century of various texts, which, as we recall from last time, in the Greek Philokalia, this would be the 4th century on theology. So various texts are theology. It's the same sort of register in which he's working now. His highly refined register of theological consideration and articulation. Passages today, just to run through them quickly. There's a dozen different things, but the first cluster rather, is numbers 1, 2, and 3, right at the very beginning, numbers 1, 2, and 3. And that's about virtue and truth and what is theoretical, strangely enough. That's the first cluster. The second will be passages, aphorisms 6 through 8. All right, and these first 1, 2, and 3, and 6, 7, and 8, it's setting up the ground for where we want to go. In 6, 7, and 8, Maximus talks about discrimination and the act of simple integration, and then he draws in faith in an interesting way, I think. 6, 7, and 8, about discrimination and integration. And then the third one, is aphorism number 13. And that reiterates, but in a refreshing way, our theme of divine union beyond apprehension, So that's 13. And then the next pair are 20 and 28. And this is where he begins to distinguish in this century between nature and grace in an interesting way. And that's one of the enduring themes.
And he wrote that, I think, just for David.
Yeah. With this in mind.
Yeah. You were in mind when he wrote that.
The fifth is 35 and 36. And this for me is one of the absolutely central, this is the first passage that really bowled me over with Maximus. And I'm working on a long work right now that arises out of part of 36. 35, 36. This is about good and evil and mistaking good for evil. Then next will be 38, aphorism 38. And that's about how the devil confounds the world through our idolatries. So the confounding result or movement of our idolatries. That's number 38. And then 42. And this we return to nature and grace, but filtered through the prism of the intellect, or the nous. So nature and grace, but filtered through, or seen through, perceived through the prism of the intellect, or nous. And then 43, which is how falsehood harrows us unto death, how falsehood is linked with death, ravages us. That's 43. And then 47 to 49, 47, 48, 49. This is about images of truth, all right? He keeps deepening our sense of image, and it's not removed from truth, but images of truth. And then the 10th one is aphorism 88. This is where Maximus talks almost concretely about spiritual movements, about figures of movement we might apply or we might contemplate in the spiritual life. And then number 92, which is about truth beyond condition, but also truth through condition. And then lastly, number 96, which is about the blessedness of all being. The blessedness of all being. I love these passages where Maximus just brings us back to the glory and the joy of creation. And he's not trying to discern or to analyze something that has gone astray. He's saying, this is our gift, right? The overall kind of theme that I tried to, that was in my mind anyways, is the difference between cleaving and cleaving, like we saw last week. The difference, i.e. between truth and a lie which seems indiscernible from the truth, or truth and illusion. So truth and its idol, in other words. Or another way of thinking about it is the distinction between presence and delusion, right? Being present to something and being deluded about something. But it's that tricky midway point between truth and lie and our struggle with discerning what is what. That's behind some of it. All right, let's begin. With the first three, I just want to read selectively from the, so aphorisms 1, 2, and 3, selectively from more or less the first sentences of each one, because there are simple points to make here, I think. This is page 188. Christ mentions, I should be in the present tense, mentions the cup before the baptism because virtue exists for the sake of truth, but truth does not exist for the sake of virtue. Okay, we have this, one of our phrases, for the sake of, which gives us our orientation or our directedness. Here, Maximus is drawing together the idea of truth and the cup, or communion, the act of communion, and locating them kind of as the apophatic for the sake of. We do everything else for the sake of, for this apophatic reality of truth and the cup, aletheia, and communion, koinonia. So that's what I want to draw out from number 1. And then look at number 2. We're still centered around truth. Truth is divine knowledge, and virtue, the struggles for truth on the part of those who desire it. Okay, truth is divine knowledge. Now, this is interesting. Divine knowledge is both knowing and unknowing, right? Divine knowledge is both knowing and unknowing when we talk about the knowledge of the divine. It is a kind of apophatic, beyond knowing and beyond unknowing. And it also has an erotic relational character, right? So Maximus is immediately deepening. He's linking it with knowledge of the divine, our idea of aletheia or truth. But he's saying, don't forget what that knowledge of the divine, how we understand that. It's beyond knowing and beyond unknowing. And somehow it involves us participating in intimate communion, right? 3 lines down from there, we read, truth cannot be grasped naturally through human efforts. Okay, so that's the other thing we're taking from it. Truth cannot be grasped naturally by human effort. And 3 words matter: truth, grasped, and naturally. Here, we'll come back to them as we proceed. So that's the second thing, the qualification or the careful compassing of the word truth. And then look at number 3. This is curious. He who seeks only the outward form of knowledge, that is, knowledge which is merely theoretical. All right, just pause there for a minute. Maximus is saying that outward, what we often think of as the most palpable, the most important, the most pressing, is actually the most theoretical. So what does that do with the inward essence of things? That's where the reality is. We've seen that before. We often tend to think, one might often tend to think though, that the further into something you go, the further beyond its conditions you go, you become more theoretical. And Maximus is turning that epistemological move on its head. And he's saying, no, the theoretical somehow is the most immediate to us, to our senses. Right? Okay, that's the first groundwork, the first pillar. Now, second, we move over to 6, 7, and 8. 6 is long, but pardon me, I'm gonna read the whole thing. Here, what we're interested in is the notion of discrimination, right? Discrimination, the cre in the middle of that word is from the same root as critique or criticism. All right, it means discernment or distinguishing. This is the central spiritual faculty, which allows us to either apprehend or be apprehended by truth, or to mistake truth. It's our discernment, and discernment is not something one can define via an idea. It's always a movement. It's always an activity. All right, so that's what we have in mind. Discrimination is the distinctive characteristic of one who probes. He then, who examines the symbols of the law in a spiritual manner, and who contemplates the visible nature of created beings with intelligence, will discriminate, will discern, will distinguish in Scripture between letter and spirit, in creation between inward essence and outward essence, and in himself between intellect and senses. Or, hearkening back to our immediately previous language, between what is substantial or essential and what is theoretical. And in Scripture, he will choose the spirit, in creation, the inner essence or logos, and in himself, the intellect. If he then unites these three indissolubly to one another, he will have found God. He will have come to recognize, as he should and as is possible, the God, that's nice, as he should and as is possible, right? Is or not. The God who is intellect, logos, and spirit. Okay, let's pause there. Let's pause there. So we discriminate, we discern, we distinguish in order to be rid of the theoretical, be rid of the superficial. But on a more deeper level, we do it in order to be able to integrate into the logos the things which belong with and to the logos, all right? So it's for the sake of Christ. Discernment is for the sake of the logos. And the logos then becomes our anchor, our common font, all right? Things are gathered for the sake of the logos, all right? Now look at 7 and 8, just briefly. I think illuminate the idea of faith in new ways, or interesting ways for me anyways. 7, the apostle gives us the following definition of faith. Faith makes real for us things hoped for, gives assurance of things not seen. Right? One may also justly define it as an ingrained blessing, or as true knowledge disclosing unutterable blessings. Here, Maximus is saying faith is palpable. Faith gives us what we can't actually yet apprehend or apperceive, all right? Either with firmness, right, as an ingrained blessing, or as emphasis, as true knowledge disclosing unutterable blessings, right? Drawing forth the unutterable blessings that are there and that are present. Faith draws them, emphasizes them, draws them forth, right? Doesn't create or notice them, just draws them forth for us. Then, number 8. Faith is a relational power, dynamis, or relationship which brings about the immediate, perfect, and supernatural union of the believer with the God in whom he believes. Here, we have faith as part of the gift of belonging, part of the gift of belonging, part of the gift of being, right? Relational dynamis, dynamic, or relationship, which brings about the immediate, perfect, and supernatural union, okay? Faith is our gift of belonging with God, which means it is our gift of being, because as we are, we belong with God. And it is also both, or its results are immediate and perfect, unmediated, pure, and perfect, whole, hail. All right. So that's faith. Okay, with these in mind now, let's move over to number 13. Number 13. And here we have a slightly longer meditation on truth and faith. And here it's about the divine union beyond apprehension, the divine union beyond apprehension. When the intellect, when the nous is in direct union with God, we just saw that's the fruit of faith. That quality in it by virtue of which it apprehends and is apprehended is completely in abeyance. All right, this is familiar to us. As soon as it activates this quality by apprehending something sequent to God, it experiences doubts and severs the union which is beyond apprehension. So long as the intellect is joined to God in this union and has passed beyond nature, remember that, beyond nature and become God by participation, it will have transposed the law of its nature as though shifting an immovable mountain. Okay, what do we have here? In direct union with God, our intellect, our nous, right? That within us which either through which we recognize being apprehended or through which we are apprehended, is set down, set to the side. Our sense of belonging and of being is given to us, given to us. It's a gift, right? Remember several weeks ago, we talked about the idea of creation and its linking with the idea of gift. This is a giving, again, the giving of creation, or the gift of presence, both immediate and perfect, recollecting the language from faith, right? Our divine union is immediate and perfect. So this direct union, which is a fruit of faith, involves the abeyance or suspension of our faculty of apprehension. Theosis, then, is and becomes clearly something to do with the gift of grace, all right? Because direct union with God is the, one is careful with words, the way, the sense, the meaning of theosis, all right? So theosis becomes something to do with the gift of grace, even in terms of our own synergy, what we understand as our own activity in synergy, in cooperation with the divine. It's beyond apprehension, beyond our apprehension. And Maximus notes, when we neglect this apophatic beyond, when we do think that we can grasp the divine, then we are immediately entangled and enmeshed again in all that is sequent to God, right? As soon as it activates this quality by apprehending something sequent to God, it experiences doubt and severs the union which is beyond intellection. All right. When we try to seize the gift and see within it our own image, we not only turn away from the divine, but we have ruined what is sequent to God in ourselves because we've come to it illegitimately, so to speak. So nature and grace, nature and grace. Let's think about this a little bit. Turn to aphorism 20. It's on page 192. What does he say here? 20 and 28 go together for me, but I'll read them both. They're both short. And this is just, again, now it's setting more ground for what will follow. Number 20. Since the principles of nature and of grace are not one and the same, fair enough, we should not be surprised if certain of the saints sometimes resisted the passions and sometimes succumbed to them. For we know that the miracle of resistance, our synergy, is due to grace, while the passion belongs to nature. The passion belongs to nature. Now, this is saying that, or it seems to me, that nature then is our register of struggle, our register of temptation. Lead us not into temptation means do ease our engagement with nature, Lord. Or there's a kind of idea of the Russian term podvig, or the Slavic term podvig, which means kind of a burden given for a future blessed result. All right, we can't understand the burden that we have been given, but we see it in terms of God's grace. That's all within nature. Then grace here becomes even more clearly than in the last passage, the oil of gladness in our synergy. The oil of gladness in our synergy, right? Even the saints, when they were too filled with nature, as it were, succumbed to sin, right? All right, so nature and grace, it seems almost dualistic here. So we know Maximus is not that way, so we have to be careful. Look at 28 now, just over the page, near the bottom, about 10 lines up or so. All right, 28. We have as a natural criterion the law of nature. This teaches us that before we can acquire the wisdom that lies in all things, that's the phrase I want to note, before we can acquire the wisdom that lies in all things, right, the blessedness that reigns in creation, we must, through mystical initiation, seek their master. All right, so he's not denigrating nature, and he's saying they need to be in appropriate relationship. Nature is for the sake of grace, as it were. All right, everything is integrated for the sake of and in and through, indeed, the Logos. Okay. Now, turn page 195. So this is moving over to 35 and 36. The stunning passages. They're all stunning. This is about when we mistake what nature means and mistake what grace is. All right. So 35. This is just to set the scene for 36. 35. Goodness, so far as the intellect is concerned, is a dispassionate predilection for the spirit. Evil is an impassioned attachment to the senses. Goodness, so far as the senses are concerned, is the impassioned activity of the body under the stimulus of pleasure. Evil is a state destitute of such activity. The only thing I want to note here is so far as goodness, so far as the something is concerned, is saying goodness for the sake of becomes this. All right. Our virtues are for the sake of and draw their integrity and their reality depending on what they are for the sake of. Okay. And then 36. And listen to this first. Just listen to this first sentence. Good Lord, have mercy. He who persuades his conscience to regard the evil he is doing as good by nature reaches out with his moral faculty as with a hand and grasps the tree of life in a reprehensible manner. For he thinks that as what is thoroughly evil is by nature immortal. And let's pause there. He who, I'm going to close read this, but let's listen to it once more. He who persuades his conscience to regard the evil he is doing as good by nature reaches out with his moral faculty as with a hand and grasps the tree of life in a reprehensible manner. For he thinks that what is thoroughly evil is by nature immortal. Okay. Now, he who persuades. So this is self-chatter. This is idle talk. This is someone trying to convince themselves of something due to some passion. He who persuades his conscience to regard the evil he is doing as good by nature. Conscience, as we've seen, is that faculty within us which does not admit lies or does not readily admit lies. So Maximus is saying that if we persuade our conscience to regard the evil we are doing as good by nature, we are searing our conscience. This is what it means. It's not about transgressing or doing a wrong act. It is being fundamentally confused about, well, we'll get to that. What is life and what is death, more or less, okay? He who persuades his conscience to regard the evil he is doing as good by nature. Now, Maximus does not mean, well, the most interesting way of reading this is not someone who regards murder as good by nature or someone who regards slander as one of the palpable sins. What he's saying here is that when we lie to ourselves that what we're doing is for the sake of the divine rather than for the sake of ourselves, okay, that's the distinction. That's the distinction. For the sake of the divine, instead of for the sake of ourselves, as it is truly, we reach out with our moral faculty as with a hand. Okay, this is a grasping. This is what we know we ought not and cannot and may not do. And grasps the tree of life in a reprehensible manner. The tree of life is the central image in the biblical scriptures. The tree of life in a reprehensible manner. Reprehension is the opposite of apprehension. So again, we're mistaking the appropriate movement for its opposite and lying about it to ourselves. For he thinks that he thinks abstractly that what he is doing, he thinks that what is thoroughly evil is by nature immortal. Okay. Something is thoroughly evil when it is wholly misguided. There is no thoroughly evil thing or act in the world. We know that, right? So it's when it is misguided. That's what thoroughly evil means. So he thinks that what is thoroughly misguided, which is completely delusion, is by nature immortal, right? And Maximus goes on to say that God will not allow this, lest we join our sin, our erring, our lie, to life itself, which is the form of blasphemy that Christ says is not permissible. It's a blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, right? We join our lie to life itself, or we see the divine or the world only through our own images. All right. And I want to say too here, the evil. I have two examples of evil. To regard the evil he is doing as good by nature reaches out. I thought a good example would be preparing for this seminar. If I'm doing this work and reading through and making notes and trying to think and trying to make sense, right? How can I contribute? How can I make it worthwhile? And I'm neglecting my wife, which assuredly has happened more than once, then what I am doing is thoroughly evil because it's thoroughly misguided, but I'm convincing myself it's good, right? That's a made up example. Papa Diamantis, in his story, The Monk, which is a beautiful, beautiful story. It's what I'm writing about with An Idiotic Good. His monk does this too, but his thoroughly evil action is to stay too long in the city, helping a parish in all good ways after a medical procedure, instead of returning to his monastery, which is really what should have happened. Okay. So when Maximus says thoroughly evil or convinces something evil is good by nature, we only think something's good by nature when it's very close to looking like something good, right? All right.
If I can just extend your
Please,
image,
no, go on. Go on,
Andrew,
David.
just a touch. In Papa Diamantis' story on the monk, as Andrew has indicated, he should have returned. But there's another part of it, which is that there is a woman and her daughter who are very lonely and isolated. And so he befriends them. And the nature of that relationship, that friendship as it develops, is one that has within it profound temptation. You know, it's the temptation to think that you and your relationship are necessary for somebody else's salvation. So it becomes thoroughly evil. So that's all.
Oh, thank you, David. That's beautifully elaborated. Yes, and that's another center of the story. Right, right. Okay, 38. Let's go to 38 for a moment now. Now, this is about how we've been leading here, how the devil confounds the world through our own idolatries. That's my way of thinking through it. 38. Excuse me. It is the devil's practice maliciously to confound the forms and shapes of sensible things. Pardon me. It is the devil's practice maliciously to confound the forms and shapes of sensible things with our conceptual images of them. Okay, I had to puzzle over this sentence. The forms and things of sensible things are confounded rather, due to our mixing up of them with our images of them. So in other words, our idolatries, our lies about the world, harm the world. They change the world for us, all right? It's not in a psychological, it's not on the level of psychology or some kind of intellectual clarity. It's on the level of being that this truth and lie is happening. Keep going. It is the devil's practice maliciously to confound the forms and shapes of sensible things with our conceptual images of them. Through these forms and shapes are generated passions for the outward aspects of visible things, right? Theoretical things. And our intellectual energy being halted, that's great, huh? Halted at the level of what pertains to sense perception, cannot raise itself to the realm of intelligible, spiritual, noetic realities. In this way, the devil despoils the soul and drags it down into the turmoil of the passions. Okay, so confound, to ruin through confusion or through inflation. That's how I understand it. To ruin through confusion or inflation. And what's being inflated, or what's the movement of inflation or confusion? We're inflating our own sense into dimensions inappropriate to it, or we're confusing our own impassioned images with the natural forms of the world. So we are dragging down nature ourselves. That's the first thing. The work of idolatry, we might come back to this. We haven't just talked about idolatry at length yet in the seminar, but we may, and David Go has thought extensively about this. The work of idolatry here seems to me to mean to technically extend ourselves, via art, via technique, via ruse, to technically extend ourselves and our own images beyond our intimate communions. All right, it's an enlargement of the self. It's a form of self-love and self-regard, where we see the world in terms of ourself, again, for the sake of. That's the first thing. Second, this is a theoretical passion. It's a passion for outward things. So it is, in other words, it's a passion based on seeming, not being. That's what he means by theoretical. It's based on seeming, not being, right? And what happens then when we get enmeshed here? He says there's a halt in our energy, our intellectual energy being halted, right? A halt in energy. This is inertia. Inertia is, by many of the fathers and mothers, and by many of us too, seen as the central hamartia of the tradition, the central error, the central sin. Inertia, the lack of the non-participation in the divine energy which permeates the world, right? Inertia. It's a deliberate lack of participation in God's energy. And what happens then? We take refuge in a lie. We lie. We say, no, this suffices. This is enough. I am good. No more movement is needed. All right. Turn to 42, please, for a moment. This is about the intellect, or the nous, and how it operates in terms of by nature and how it operates in terms of by grace. All right. This is a sharp rebuke to us taking our own lie seriously, to us thinking, even presuming to consider that our idolatries match the world. 42. The intellect has by nature, the capacity to receive a spiritual knowledge of corporeal and incorporeal things, right? That's the sum of human knowledge right there. But by grace alone does it receive revelations of the Holy Trinity. By grace alone does it receive revelations of the Holy Trinity, not images. We have images of the divine throughout creation. We're talking about a revelation, an insight, or some kind of thing that I don't comprehend. While believing that the Trinity exists, the human intellect can never presume to grasp what the Trinity is in its essence, in the way that this is known to the divine intellect. The person without spiritual knowledge is completely ignorant of the way in which sin is purged by virtue. Okay, leaving aside that last sentence, we could come back to it later if we want, but considering the first two. By nature, the intellect has the capacity to receive spiritual knowledge, real knowledge, true knowledge of corporeal and incorporeal things. But by grace alone does it receive revelations of the Holy Trinity. Okay, so now we have a deepened sense of nature. Nature is where our struggle, our toil, right? It is referred to grace, but it is also the register in which we apprehend. It's the register in which we work, right? We work. And grace then, by contrast, is the register in which we are apprehended, in which God works, or God is the, oh, forgive me, I shouldn't talk like this. God acts, pardon me. Nature and grace. Revelations of the Trinity are by grace. What's a revelation? It's a truth that calls to us. It's to kalon. It's the good, the beautiful, that which calls to us, right? A revelation is a calling. It's a personal calling. It's not a revelation of an image or a sentence, right? It's a revelation of movement, of more movement. So in this way, we might say the integral dance of the Holy Trinity, the integral dance of the Holy Trinity is to be loved. We can't arrange for its revelation. We can't arrange for its grace to come to us, right? But we can love it. The integral dance of the Holy Trinity is to be loved, not to be figured or figured out, right? Not to be figured or figured out, especially via our own images. When we start thinking that we have given figure to, or figured out the divine, God forbid, or even the divine in someone else, Maximus is saying we are in error, right? That's not part of our struggle. We're to love, not to figure out. 43. When we do think, though, that we have figured out something, especially divine. 43. He who loves falsehood, we always love our own best images. I always do anyways. He who loves falsehood is handed over to be harrowed by it, so that by suffering he may come to know what it is he has willingly pursued, and may learn by experience that he mistakenly embraced death instead of life. All right. So lies, our own figures, lies ravage or harrow us. It's such a it's a moving word. It's a strong word. What is next? Handed over to be harrowed by us. God grants us our desired participation. God grants us our desired participation for good or for ill, but that we might see the end of it. That we may see its telos, its final, its finality, all right? Which means both that we have to undergo suffering or undergo trials in this life due to our own self, but also that there is an end to it, that God is allowing us to be in error, to undergo, as it were, allowing us, because our will be sanctified by its end, by its ultimate for the sake of, right? By its ultimate for the sake of. That's the second thing to take from this. The third thing to take from it is that Maximus is directly equating life, Zoe, with truth, aletheia, and death with falsehood. All right. Again, these are not linguistic or epistemological terms anymore. These are on an ontological level, on the deepest spiritual level. All right, that's 43. 43. Now we're getting there. 47 to 49. 47 through 49. We turn a little bit more to more positive, say, images now, or positive subject matter, in a way. Maximus is leaving off remonstrating or admonishing or helping clarify for us, and now he's giving us some things. 47 through 49. All right. Compared with the righteousness of the age to be, all earthly righteousness fulfills the role of a mirror. It contains the image of archetypal realities, not the realities themselves as they subsist in their true and universal nature. That's important. And compared with knowledge there, all spiritual knowledge in this world as an indistinct image. It contains a reflection of the truth, but not the truth itself. And then as it is destined to be revealed. That's the important phrase there. That's 47. Moving on. Since what is divine consists in virtue and spiritual knowledge, the mirror displays the archetypes of virtue and the indistinct image reveals the archetypes of spiritual knowledge. Okay, so they act. He who has conformed his life to God's will through practice of the virtues transposes his intellect to the realm of intelligible realities by means of theoria. By doing so, he places himself utterly beyond the reach of everything that seeks to entrap him, and so is not attracted through some sensory image towards the death that lies in the passions. Here now, death is linked with passions. Previously, it was linked with lies. But let's think for a minute. Image and reality, mirror and reality. Maximus, we have to be careful here because he's not being a Gnostic. Again, he's not promoting a dualism. So what is the distinction between image and reality? Well, part of what we may construe here is in the phrases, not the realities themselves as they subsist in their true and universal nature, right? Or as it is destined to be revealed. An image is somehow stilled, right? An image is somehow it's paused. It's a pause in energy. Truth and experience and energy flow. When you pause a flow, you're not less real. It's just not the full image. It's not the full reality of it, right? Pauses then allow for distillation and form giving, right? To give form is to pause or to set something a certain way. But we mustn't mistake their momentary abstraction for absolute. We must not mistake a spiritual image for an absolute, right? For the whole truth. Images do give us the truth. And we live right now in the age of images, as Maximus says, the age of truth is to come. So this is real. But the whole truth, the all-embracing aletheia is more, is beyond even what we're given. Okay. And then the last one, he who has conformed his life to God's will. All right, working through the images. This is another rendition of the idea that our will is sanctified by its end. All right, inertia is the sin. Ongoing struggle and energy is holy somehow. All right. Speaking of energy and movement, let's turn to 88. 88, which is 206. 88. When I first read this, I read Ineffable and I went away and I had all these thoughts and I came back and I realized I misread it. Ineffable would have been more poetic, so it's good. Ineffaceable somehow is stronger here. Ineffaceable knowledge, whose spiritual gyration around God's infinitude is unconditioned and beyond intellection. Images in its unconditionality, the more than infinite glory of the truth. All right. Ineffaceable knowledge, essential knowledge, eternal knowledge, right? Spiritual gyration around God infinitude. This is a movement of gyration, right? There are images of linearity, of circularity, of spiral. David Goa likes spiral. This is gyration. This introduces another form and a metaphor into our attempts to be present to what happens in this kind of thing. Spiritual gyration, that's spiritual movement 1. And then he refers to the more than infinite glory of the truth, the more than infinite glory of aletheia. We have characterized truth as movement, as a bringing to light, as a drawing to presence, right? So this is still within the realm of spiritual movement, the movement of truth, which calls to us, which draws us near. Tokalon, right? The infinity. Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. Christ, he extends his hands to us. This is another image of movement. Okay. So here, image is related to truth, right? As lie is related to illusion, or rather truth is to image, as lie is to illusion. Truth is to image as lie is to illusion. That's the claim I'm making. The image is the fruit of truth. It is that which allows truth to draw near, and illusions lead us into lie, into the state of falsehood, as he says. 92. This is the last substantial one, and then we just have one more. Just as God in his essence cannot be the object of man's spiritual knowledge, so not even his teaching can be fully embraced by our understanding. For though Holy Scripture, being restricted chronologically to the times of the events which it records, is limited where the letter is concerned, yet in spirit it always remains unlimited as regards, in relation to, the contemplation of intelligible realities. Here he's talking about a truth beyond condition, a truth beyond condition, all right? And yet, in that word beyond, the apophatic word, we understand that it's not a rejection or a negation. It's remember, a moving from within, through, with, and beyond, right? The truths of the scriptures are true because that's how they're put. There's not an abstract truth that could be put, differently in another thing, as if it doesn't matter how it's said, as if concrete life, the person, doesn't matter, right? So if we think of the truth beyond condition as the truth that is from within, through, with, and beyond the conditions, then we have a sense of how Bakhtin's word chronotope, how the concrete image, the concrete person, gives unto the eternal, how the world of time and space really points us to the eternal, to the divine, right? Because truth is beyond condition, but beyond involves that condition, right? Another way of putting this, one may not abstract from a concrete situation or event or scene without ruining its integrity. To abstract from something is to ruin the integrity of that scene, that gift, that being, or the idea that word and world belong together. Word and world belong together. Okay, 96. Just to finish up, it's over the page. It's at the top of 208. In his, pardon me, in his supreme goodness, God has not only made the divine and incorporeal essences of noetic realities, okay, images of his unutterable glory. So even what we will experience, the greatest reality we'll experience, are still images of his unutterable glory, each in its own way reflecting, insofar as this is granted, the supra-noetic splendor of his unapproachable beauty. He also permeates, okay, so not only, but also he permeates with echoes of his majesty things that are sensory and far inferior to noetic essences. These enable the human intellect mounted upon them and carried above all visible things, from within, through, with, and beyond all visible things, to journey towards God and to attain the summit of blessedness. So images are appropriate. Images are not inferior. We need to remove that idea from our spiritual language. I need to remove that idea from my spiritual language. Images are appropriate, not inferior, as if there was something else within immediate reach that would be better. Images don't stand in for reality. They're drawing us to reality. It also points to the blessedness of all being. Look at that line 3 lines down. Each in its own way reflecting, insofar as this is granted. Isn't that beautiful? Each in its own way reflecting, insofar as this is granted, the unapproachable beauty of our Lord. Wow. And then only I wanted to note the gladness proper to what has been granted. The gladness proper to what has been granted. This is all cast in terms of a gift. And our fundamental disposition as human beings is, as David nicely parsed, joyous being, a glad being, a thankful being. That's our discernment. That's our openness to the divine and to the world. Right. Okay. That's the end of what I had to say, have in mind. If anything stands out or what have you, let's follow our noses. I have 3 kind of questions that I would like to ask in general, if we want to ponder, if we don't want to ponder. The first is just to probe that last idea, truth beyond conditions and truth arising from conditions apophatically. What do we make of that? That's one question. And then the discernment needed, the deep discernment to be able to see aright truth and see aright a lie and see aright nature and see aright grace, because our confusion, our confounding of these things is what gives birth to our error. That's the second question. And then the third, and this is a terrifying question to me, what if one mistakes one's own for the sake of? What if one is in such delusion that I think I am acting for the sake of God, but my God is myself, or my God is that woman, or some abstract passion or idea. So what if one mistakes one's own for the sake of? Obviously, that happens all the time. So the real question is, what are we taught in the tradition in Maximus? What are we taught to help us to discern rightly the telos of our actions or our thoughts, right? Rough hew them as we will, as Hamlet says.
Andrew, on that last point, they're so intertwined. The people who I find so godly, but they, it was David, this story of the monk, and I'm not sure I may have heard it before. I'm not sure I know it, but there's so many well-meaning people who assume that God has called them to help others, and whether or not it's you say he should have gone back to the hermitage. It's that should that always, it may be externally it's easy to see, but internally, as you say, mixing up your for the sake of, to me, is just so commonplace, and it's so inextricably linked that both what motivates me and what actually I ought to motivate me. But I really find the parable of the wheat and the tares really important. That no, don't pull it out. Just leave it to the end of the time, and it'll all get sorted out. Because I don't know the tools that would be able to, from my perspective, where I'm the depravity of the way I see things. How do I apply that in a way external to myself? Anyway, that's.
I'm with you. I'm struggling there with you. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the murkiness with which one must approach this has to be the reason for such a strong sense of moralism in people who are concerned about their own image.
Mhm.
I mean that as innocently as possible, concerned about their own image. I'm not
Yeah.
speaking rudely. Because at least then you think, well, even if I don't know anything else, at least I'm doing good work. And then eventually you forget about that first part and you just think, I'm doing good work. But then that's its own confusion, because the I is the most important word in that sentence, which means that we're into self-love and we're circling back around ourselves. Huh.
I mean, that posture of humility is so, the essence of the Trinity is so important here for us, but what if I'm wrong? It's sort of always the question. That's what I love about the four quartets, right? The gift of humility. It's the only thing that we get.
Yeah, is it in the four quartets where he talks about the still point of the turning world?
Yeah.
Because I had that line down in my notes,
Yeah.
and then I looked, I forgot where it was. I didn't want to quote it. Yeah, I thought so. Yeah, for me, that's the image of Christ as center of integration, the still point of the turning world. Yeah, or the the peace at the center of confusion. Yeah.
I think Kierkegaard tries to get to this, to get past the moralism, with the either or, to say, yeah, neither are adequate in this journey where we want to get to the summit, as 96 calls us. That moralism might be the training wheels we need as we sort of try to figure this out, but eventually they won't do it.
No, it's infantile.
Yeah.
That's the problem. It's perfect for an infant, right? But as is it St. Paul gives metaphors of the spiritual life, I don't suck anymore, now I drink wine or what have you, right? I'm not at my mother's breast still. Yeah. There's something that's nagging me. There's some answer or response to this idea about mistaking one's own for the sake of, in the idea that truth cannot really be beyond conditions, in the truth that in the idea that truth arises from condition apophatically. There's something there, I think. I don't know what it is. Do you, Michael or David?
I'll let David go first, I think.
Oh, Michael, please don't.
I'm kind of hesitating to invoke the name of a philosopher whom Kierkegaard wasn't kind to, namely Hegel. But I keep on sort of struggling with Hegel's notion of the potentious, or the tremendous power of the negative. And when he, because in relation to that, he invokes the concept of death. And part of the context is simply this is in the preface to the phenomenology of spirit, by the way. And he, it reminded me of and I'm sort of struggling to put this. It might be too subtle, or it might just be mistaken, but in number 43, this, this is related to your last question. The prospect of someone who loves falsehood and is thereby handed over to be harrowed by it. And this is kind of analogous. It could be going in a slightly different direction. And maybe I'm trying too hard to coordinate. It could Hegel with Maximos here. Maybe I shouldn't even think in those terms. And by suffering, he may come to know this person who is handed over, whom falsehood is handed over to be harrowed by falsehood. By suffering, he may come to know what it is he willingly pursued. He may learn by experience that he mistakenly embraced death instead of life. So obviously, well, not obviously, but let's agree that one wants to reject death and rather to embrace life. And yet there could be a danger that one is so apprehensive, filled with a kind of angst, anxiety, a kind of, bordering on despair, a kind of worry about falling into this trap. I'm just reiterating the kind of vexing point that David was making, that one might just skirt away from one's mistakes and not experience the suffering that they entail, that one is being harrowed by. And I think that would be a mistake, especially since in complicated matters, grace isn't always just helping us along. Sometimes when we embrace falsehood, the suffering is there for a kind of purpose. And by allowing that for which is harrowing us to have its way in a sense, obviously we're repulsed by it, we potentially, our falsehood can potentially die. So Hegel actually, I don't think he's being frivolous either. He says that it's important to linger with one's falsehood. One realizes that falsehood is a falsehood, but not simply to avoid it at arm's length, but when one is immersed and recognizes that there's a falsehood, to recognize that one has to, in a sense, die. One has to, it sounds odd. That's why I'm kind of being very apprehensive here, because it sounds counterintuitive and bizarre to say one has to embrace death. Obviously, one doesn't want to do that, but one has to embrace it in as much as one has to embrace that one has been thinking and perhaps acting in the world for the sake of death. And if one doesn't admit that, then one, in a sense, has sort of kept death at bay rather than allow it to do its work and to, I suppose that, this is the, I'm extrapolating a little bit here, but this is the sense of a precondition of any kind of resurrection. One has to die to something in order to transform one's view. And so it might not always be an easy question of simply embracing life, the tree of life. Might be in our fallen state that we, and Hegel thought this was the nature of the history of philosophy, and there's it's not an implausible point of view.
Luther says, sin boldly, but love Christ more boldly. It kind of gets that of I like what you're saying, Michael. If we're so reticent to actually act because we're concerned that we will be harrowed, then we get, the harrowing has an end to it, not only a finish to it, but a purpose to it. Whereas not acting doesn't. That's the inertia. That's really the problem. So we do it but love, more boldly love Christ, so that knowing that if there is harrowing to be had, it will be had for the right purpose.
Yeah, no, I think Maximus talks a lot about hope, and so if we can't imagine a way past, then of course we do sink in despair. I mean, Blake he was writing around the same time as Hegel, and I often find strange affinities. Often people compare aphorisms of Blake to Nietzsche, but I think often Hegel is a kind of more obvious. There's some more obvious comparisons. It's kind of hard because Blake is, lucid and aphoristic, and it's hard to kind of connect him easily with Hegel. But Blake, says something similar. It's important to, push through one's passions even when they're wrong, as opposed to trying to keep outside them. But
isn't it also the case that in some sense, when the passion is the motivation, if you don't live through it, even when you realize it's death dealing, if you don't live through it, there is a danger that if you just set it aside, is this part of what you were getting at, Michael? If you have whatever it takes to set it aside, it's just going to come around again in a new form. The harrowing, we have an icon in the Christian East. It's called the harrowing of hell. It's a bit of a misnomer. It's a curious title for it. It's the anastasis. It's Jesus Christ reaching down into the pit and pulling forth Adam and Eve. I also think, I did spend a little time on the farm as a kid. And harrowing is something you do in the farm.
Yeah.
Every fall. You have to, how do we loosen up the soil of our life? How do we open it up enough so that a little more water can come in? That maybe the tares that David talked about don't completely dominate. And maybe some new seed can sprout. So the falsehood is what hands us over to the harrowing. It's not God. It's not even Satan. It's in the nature of that which is not life-giving, but which appears to be. And so we are harrowed by it. And if that is lived through, you may come to know something about it.
David, is it the truth? Is it true that it is the falsehood that hands us over for harrowing, or it's our love of the falsehood that hands us over?
That's very well said, David.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the fact that it's so palpable to us, and you can't get any perspective on it. You can't see in any deep way what's brought this about, what's motivated, what your stance is. I was thinking and I don't want to break this off, but it's just a little footnote. It occurred to me in reading this section, I came, when he talks about contemplation, it had never occurred to me before how contempt is part of that word. And that the difference between contempt and contemplation is in both you're standing above. That is, in both you're not bounded by. You're not, but in contempt, you're standing above in a way that looks down upon, that dismisses or sees in one particular way. And a lot of priests have mentioned to me, and I've seen it a little bit myself, that people who are caught in a particular kind of passion, they have contempt for themselves, even though they continue to do it. It's a kind of addiction. How do you live through addiction? How do you get to the point where it is exhausted? Maybe something else can take place. Contemplation is an attentiveness which is not invested with something. It's coming from you. It's not invested by our passions. But that's just an aside. I like the idea that contempt is there in contemplation. And these are two entirely different ways of being attentive. Contempt is a way of seeing.
But it's a thwarted way. It only sees the one thing, which of course produces contempt.
Yeah.
Whereas contemplation sees the both and, that allows you to weigh things.
And awaits.
And awaits. And with a humility, and as you say,
Yeah.
not born out of the passions.
Yeah.
Hi, Lorraine.
Hi, Lorraine.
We finally say hello.
Sorry for missing the first half. My apologies. I just couldn't shift a meeting.
We were reading about being handed over to be harrowed by. Was the meeting harrowing?
It wasn't that bad. It wasn't that bad.
Just to come back to Michael's point for a minute, I wanted to just offer two things. First, the idea that one thoroughly explores that which one would regard as error. That strikes me as a beautiful feature of a novelist. I thought of Dostoevsky or Papadimoutis, who through their characters explore fully with their own internal logic, positions, stances, moral, discernment, different to their own. The other thing that I like that you came to that line, that so that by suffering he may come to know what he has willingly pursued. And I like the connection with Hegel. And I think, and what Jennings and Goa, what you said, I thought was very, very fine. I always like to think of the things that look most the same, So when I read this, falsehood, truth, the truth and lie, this is not lying about the state of something. This is a lie that looks exactly like a truth until you understand it's not. And we live our truths. Our truths are what draw us in this direction or bring to light this, right? They're movement within us. So if we discover that what we thought was a truth by which we've been living is a lie, that means we absolutely must work through what that means. First of all, because just like you said, Michael and David, if we put it aside, then we haven't gotten rid of it at all. It's the parable of sweeping the house clean and leaving the door wide open and rushing off to, get drunk. And you come back, there are 10 more strangers there, right? That's the first thing. Well, let's leave it at that. They look the same and we've lived it, so we have to work through it. If we slough it aside, we risk not having the discernment. And the only difference between living through a truth or living through a lie is our discernment.
And it's loved, as he says. It's what we love. So you can't just dismiss it or get over it.
No. Yeah. It's drawn us forth.
And usually these things, we kind of integrate our lives around them. So it takes time.
What do we make of, so Elaine, we read Lorraine, I'm tired. Lorraine, we read a number of passages. 3 questions we were kind of pondering at the end, one of which we've just gone a wonderful long way down, which is, what if one mistakes one's own for the sake of? What if we think we're acting for the sake of the divine or for the sake of something good, when in fact it's another end that we're seeking, right? And the second had to do with, and we also touched this via Michael's introductory comments, the difference between the discernment needed to perceive the difference between truth and lie, or nature and grace, which look the same, right? They look the same. That's the thing. And then we also wondered, is there a possibility of truth beyond conditions? Or what is the relationship of truth arising from, apophatically arising from conditions? So the relationship between truth and conditions. David, go. I know you have such a love for scripture. I want to ask you this a little bit more directly. Where does he, in which aphorism does he, it might be 6, where he distinguishes, he makes a series of stark distinctions, which make it sound like he's disdaining the letter, the concrete, the scene, the palpable for the abstract. I think there was 6 and there was 1 more, but Goa, you've read the whole thing anyways. Let me see, is it 88? No.
Well, in 6, he certainly does say discriminate in scripture between letter and spirit.
Yeah, let's just stay with that. Goa, and others too, but beginning with you, Goa, what do you make of this? What do you make of his emphases here? Because he keeps coming back to it, and he can't mean what he seems to mean, because even just reading him, one can feel a palpable just love of the scriptures, right? He lives with them and through them. He's not disdaining the song. He's not disdaining the figure. But what is he doing? Pardon me if I'm putting you on the spot and your mind is going another direction. Feel free to.
Well, let's read it again, and then I think David Jennings should take a crack at this off the stop.
Sure. Schools rush in, man.
Discrimination is the distinctive characteristic of one who probes. He then, who examines the symbols of the law in a spiritual manner, and who contemplates the visible nature of created beings with intelligence, will discriminate in scripture between letter and spirit, in creation between inner essence and outward appearance, and in himself between intellect and the senses. It's a trinity. And in scripture, he will choose the spirit. In creation, the inner essence or logos. And in himself, the intellect. If he then unites these three indissolubly in one another, he will have found God. He will have come to recognize, as he should and as is possible, the God whose intellect, logos, and spirit. In this way, he will be delivered from all things which deceive the human being and seduce him into innumerable errors. Delivered, that is to say, from the letter, being stuck on the surface of the text, the outward appearance of things, how they look to us in a moment, and the senses, all of which possess quantitative distinctions and are the negation of unity. But if a person compounds the letter of the law, the outward appearance of visible things, and his own senses with each other, he is so short-sighted as to be blind, sick through his ignorance of the cause of created beings. Whether, I mean, what do you mean, David?
Yeah.
Yeah, this doesn't sound entirely unfamiliar to you, does it?
No, not about the law. Yeah. And the letter and the spirit. I think that drawing on number 3, where he just makes he's emphasizing the outward form of knowledge is merely theoretical. And it's the merely, you know, it's not that theoretical is wrong, but if it is a reductionist to only theoretical, then it has that problem. And I think that's where the letter of the law is. I mean, the letter, it's whatever he believes, it's not less than the letter.
Yeah. But it's the letter and something that's opening.
Yeah. You know, the letter is to go beyond the theoretical. It is to draw us toward the spiritual, as any image is supposed to do. But if we're stuck at that and it becomes merely theoretical, that's when I think we have that problem. So, and throughout everything we read so far, I mean, he certainly is quite comfortable not only being very clear about what the scripture says on a theoretical meaning, but he's also very comfortable extrapolating to all sorts of things that you have to admire someone who is a really great trapeze artist to not scream, "Don't be an idiot," when they let go and they're flying through the air and everything else. And when you watch Maximus, you're fine with it. I think there are other people who let go and you're thinking, "Don't be an idiot." So, but that's because he's already gone through the letter. It's not less than the letter, but he goes through it to that spiritual. I don't believe that he would say, you know, as he says later on, in what was it, 88, whatever, that you know, that scripture is limited to the chronological time and place in which it is set. And so there's some limitations there that necessarily mean that this can't be a fulsome description of God. However incarnated it is, God is more than that. So if we're not willing to go beyond that, then I think we're somehow limiting that journey, that from the theoretical to to a greater reality.
Yeah.
But it's difficult because I can't think of a theological argument today where both sides don't say exactly the same thing that way. And this is where perhaps Andrew's point about the lie, for all intents and purposes, looks like the truth until you dig down into it, and both believe that that's what they're, that it's for the sake of something other.
When I read it for the first time, I thought, if you look at biblical scholarship over the last 120 years, which has been evangelical literalists squaring off against liberal modernists.
Yeah.
And both of them are stuck on the surface of the text.
Yeah.
And as a result, there are generations that have been raised to think the scripture, well, they've been inoculated to read the scripture in any way that reveals to them something about their life and about their spiritual life, because they've been taught that it's about history or science or a moral or a theological argument. It's unbelievable the difference of our world from this world where that wasn't at play. But in all three of these, whether it's the scripture, creation, or the intellect, what is so striking to me is that all three of those for him is trying to help us understand what these amazing gifts are. And that they're invitations to see unfolding, to see the unfolding, not to close off, not to close down, not to presume, but that in all these three aspects of life, something is being unveiled for us.
Yeah.
But don't assume that what you think it is at the moment is what it is. You glimpse it, and you are to do your best to be in the presence of it. And respond, but not respond to its continuous unveiling.
In a sense, the letter would not only, maybe I'm being perhaps overly provocative just to test this hypothesis, but the letter itself, theoretical, doesn't even generate the creeds for you, let alone, Maximus. There has to be, you have to get past that theoretical letter to get to that place past spiritual knowledge to revelation. And if there's revelation and one is only willing to hear letter, I think you discount the revelation, because it's something that can't be, proof text. And I don't mean proof text in the pejorative sense, but revelation goes deeper than that.
Yeah.
It's odd, David, because I think often we think of discernment as being of the eye or of the mind, and how you just put it so beautifully, we're not able to hear them. That's a discernment of the ear. Maybe the ear, we talk about the call of God, we talk about the voice, we talk about the word. Maybe our better metaphor is the ear.
Yeah.
That's the biblical one. That's the Jewish one.
Oh, hear, O Israel, not O see, O Israel.
It's the Jewish creed.
Yeah.
Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And I know I've spoken about this before, but I'm always so touched by how Jews read the Torah. They don't read it silently. They don't read it privately. They read it out loud when there are 10 gathered. And it's always out loud. It has to go into your ear. And there has to be 10 present because any particular person might think they've understood it. And you need 10 people to argue with. And as we know, where there's 2 Jews, there are 6 opinions. It's a dynamic word, and it's an unfolding word, and it's an unfinished word, and it's a word being made flesh.
And the opposite of inertia, the opposite of that stopping, which we keep coming back to, that lack of energy, that pretending we can slough something off. Yeah.
And it's so odd when you think of the whole development of neo-scholastic theology, whether it's Lutheran or Calvinist or Catholic. I don't think this is what was behind that, but for generations following those great intellectual developments, it was often just frozen for them. And it no longer was a spiritual word. It was an intellectual construct.
It was a taxonomy.
Yeah.
You wanted to pin the butterfly onto something.
Yeah, that's a great image of it. And even the more demanding part of that little text is we do that with human beings and their struggles and their glories. And that's worse. That's killing the movements of their soul.
Maybe that's his gentle way. He focuses in on the letter and then links it twice or thrice, perhaps, with these other common, all too common errors. And he says, these are joined together. These are akin. And if one pauses and attends, one thinks, oh, what he's also talking about is this death dealing I do here, or this, neglecting I do here.
It's striking for me that the tradition that he stands in as well, when we go back to the Cappadocians and the Desert Fathers, and somebody like Evagrius Ponticus, when they would listen to confessions, people would come and talk with them. In those early centuries, really up through the 12th century at least, I think. Judging from the penitentials that exist from that early period, beginning with Evagrius Ponticus and his chapters on prayer. Ponticus or others, they never made any distinction between whether the sin that a person appeared to be confessing was actually an act or a thought. If they were confessing it, then you had to walk around it or help them walk around it, help them deepen their understanding of where that's coming from, what that's about. So in a sense, the well, I mean, he's such a master of this in his notion of thoughts, and that whether the thought has given birth to action or not, it's telling you something about your condition and your disposition. And that's what's really important, for that disposition to come to a place of peace, come to integration.
Goa, can I look at you again? I want to come back to this aphorism 36, the one that I exclaimed about earlier. I don't just want to look at you, Goa. I want to look at you, Bork, and all else. 36. I read the first, 4 lines. Right? If you will, David, will you close read it?
He who persuades his conscience to regard the evil he is doing as good by nature reaches out with his moral faculty as with a hand and grasps the tree of life in a reprehensible manner. For he thinks that what is thoroughly evil is by nature immortal. He thinks it shares in the eternal. Therefore, God, who has implanted in man's conscience a natural hatred of evil, cuts him off from life, for he has now become evil in his will and intention. God acts in this way, so that when a person does wrong, he cannot persuade his own conscience that what is thoroughly evil is good by nature.
Walk us through, David.
Well, my sense is that I don't know how common this is for human beings, but I unfortunately know a little bit about it. Of the act of becoming convinced that something is good by nature, that it somehow participates in the eternal. So in a sense, it's an attempt to grasp the tree of life. And in that sense, we think again of the temptation in the garden, which was, of course, a temptation to become like God. It's that part of the mind which longs for God. And even in the midst of communion, the only way the human nature can hear the temptation, even hear the temptation, is if they've forgotten that they already are like God. So that kind of evil, that which looks so much like life and like what is a good, what is, or what participates in the eternal. Cuts one off from life.
And doesn't the word grasp, I mean, immediately calls, I don't know if it's the translator who's trying to make a point or not, but you're immediately thrown into Philippians 2:6. Christ, who in the form of God did not count equality with God as a thing to be grasped.
To be grasped, yeah.
And as you're saying, the tree of life, where obviously we're not in the form of God as Christ is in the form of God, but as we are in some form of Christ likeness, we ought not to count equality with God a thing to be grasped. And here, when you can persuade your conscience to regard the evil by doing good, that you are doing good and you get to define it, you are, in a sense, acting as your own little God.
Yeah.
And you are grasping that. It is so.
And your own passions.
Yeah.
Replace the passion of Christ.
Yeah, I mean, it is so un-Christ-like in that we specifically learn how one ought to be through Philippians 2:6. Well, through the life of Christ, but as it's articulated in Philippians 2:6. To come as a suffering servant instead.
Yeah. Emptying
ourselves.
Yeah. The opposite of emptying yourself.
Yeah.
And it cuts you off from life.
Yeah.
And it harms the will and intention. And this is something I hope we're going to be able to spend more time on. I'm really interested in Maximus' understanding of the will, and where the will is in all of this sort of thing, because there was a big argument that took place around Jesus Christ's wills, but I think there's something in that to illuminate this that I want to understand.
I want to make two. I really like what was just said. Really like it. I have no only gratitude for it. I want to make two statements. I'm wondering what David and Lorraine and Michael, what you think of the line, therefore God, who has implanted in man's conscience a natural hatred of evil.
Yeah.
What you understand by the word hatred? Okay, that's the first question. That's the first thing, and then. Oh yeah, the last sentence. God acts in this way so that a man who does wrong, so that when a man does wrong, when a person does wrong, they cannot persuade their own conscience that what is thoroughly evil is by nature good. The preservation of the conscience, right? The need for an ongoing health of that thing within us, which will not admit lies. Right, back to lying and truth, which will not readily admit lies. Right? That's what the conscience is. It's for the sake of the conscience that the intervention happens. Maybe. So those two, I'm offering them as kind of thoughts to put out there. First of all, I'm very interested in each of your understanding of the word hatred. And then second, the last sentence and its relation to the word conscience. And what conscience is.
Well, at the beginning of it, of course, he's talking about how we persuade.
Yeah.
We persuade it, we convince, and you talked about this initially, Andrew, that something which in retrospect is evil is good by nature.
Hmm.
And not only good by nature, but somehow participates in that which we imagine to be eternal or ultimate in some form. So what I understand by implanted in man's conscience a natural hatred of evil. I mean, this is a shorthand way, I think, of saying that the human nature and the human conscience is such that when one mistakes death for life and walks with it, that over a period of time, and I think time is really important here, it takes time. It will come to be because it will cut you off from life. It will harm your will. It will harm your intentions. Over time, hatred arises. Now, it's a strong, strong term he's using. I don't think I would ever put it that God acts in this way myself. But I think the point is that the nature of being human is so, and because Maximus understands us and all of creation as having its own logos, its own the integrity of its own becoming, that in that we are made that way. Again, over time, one's own conscience will cause us to hate who we are and how we've been. But that's not the end. For some people, and Lorraine knows, I think, an awful lot about this through her work, when that kind of self-loathing develops in a person, that's a whole nother challenge. But it is a witness. It is a prophetic voice that's speaking, and I think he's saying it's our conscience speaking to us. My own sense is that often people that are sort of hyper moralists, they've gotten stuck in that personal self-loathing stage because they themselves have sinned against themselves in serious ways. And so they've somehow gotten through it, but they have not addressed the self-loathing part of it and had that healed. And so they then transfer that onto others who sin the way they did. And further the harm. So my take, I'll finish with this, is that he's describing the kind of movement of the conscience over time where there is serious misunderstanding and the replacing of that which is death dealing with what was life giving. So in the long run, he's saying you can't persuade your conscience that
Mhm, mhm,
something that is evil is good by nature, but it's in the long run.
mhm.
It's not in the short run.
And David, it's not a determinist or a progressive type of thing with time. There has to be that metanoia.
Yeah.
At some point, because, you know, as we often think, you know, you really can only come up with these really incredible evil things if you're really, you know, scholarly about it. Yeah. Or, you know, the average person doesn't convince themselves. It takes a, you know, a master's degree in critical theory or fill in your blank, where you start to make A is not A and convince yourself of it. But there is
Dostoevsky's-
ultimately.
I'm very sorry. Go on.
No, go ahead. Yep.
No, please.
I just think that that's, you know, it would be, from what you said, and I think I know you well enough, but it is not that time, the longer the time, the more this will happen. You can have time actually making it worse and worse and worse.
Of course. Usually
until that metanoia.
usually does.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the justification is working from 7 different directions.
Yeah.
And it's being explored along that path until you come to the end. I don't know. What do the rest of you have to say?
That justification, David, that justification, you know too, the justification means alignment. That's one of those words like cleaving, which is turning with the truth and the lie that we're trying to figure. I'm very sorry for breaking on you earlier, Jennings. I didn't intend to, pardon me. I was going to say that kind of, I loved your point, that it takes a certain cleverness, a certain kind of, you said scholarliness. I thought of Dostoevsky with this critique of he's always going on about the clerics, but also the students, you know, those who are intellectually, theoretically at the surface of engaging with things and staying at that level, and then imagining that fulfills a figure of the whole. Pardon me, I just had those 2 little things.
So if we take an example of this, David, and it's from the Papadimante's novel or short story about the monk. In that short story, the monk is, every night he goes over and spends time with the mother and the daughter. And, you know, they drink a little wine together, they eat together, they talk about spiritual things, they talk about lots of stuff. And this goes on for some time. The monk is feeling, if I remember, Andrew, you've read it more closely than I, but
Go on.
you have a sense that the monk has a kind of guilty conscience about the decisions he's made and that he hasn't gone back to the monastery. And what does that mean? Going back to the monastery, of course, is kind of metaphor for being rerouted in the process of integration.
Integrity, yeah.
And integrity. And this only, the metanoia moment is the night he goes over there and it becomes apparent to him. I should maybe let Andrew speak about this instead of me. It becomes apparent to him that this has become sexual, you know, eroticized on the part of both of the women, and more profoundly on his part. And so he has the presence of mind to say goodnight and to go home, and then to make hasty arrangements and get out of town, go back to the monastery. So what I was pointing to was the the sort of intellectual experimentation in justification around particular kinds of relationships and understandings. And then that metanoia moment came, and he responded.
That's great, David. And just following from that too, that moment that you described, the erotic moment, it's curious because the deepest metaphor for spiritual relating or relationship is eros, but it was a false eros. It wasn't true. It was a false, right? And what it consists of was him actually seeing for the first time their figures. Prior to that, he had had his own figure of them, his own image of them, his own idol of them. He was just operating through that, thinking, oh, it's all, this is, he was talking to a painting. When he realized the reality of what he was doing, the presence, when he actually became present, to refer back to earlier language, to what was to the encounter, then he realized that although he had none, it wasn't as if he was grasping or seizing or any of these other terms we could use. But going back to something you said earlier, Goa, the non-distinction between thought and action, he suddenly realized he had been lying to himself about the reality of this relationship. And that to him is as good as erring more palpably. And so he removed himself. It's an extraordinary subtle, it's a beautiful, beautiful story.
It almost seems like the sort of inverse denouement of one of James Joyce's short stories, the title of which is going to escape me. Someone, Andrew, you'll probably recall it, where a man who happens to be an avid reader of Nietzsche cultivates the relationship with a woman, and rather than sort of recognizing or being present to an attraction which is developing, as soon as that idea surfaces, he suddenly feels not a natural anger, but a kind of contempt, which is also part of his stemming from his moral faculty. And it's a very
that's the other way this can work.
Horrible. I mean, he's not a monk, so it's a different set of background constraints, obviously.
We're all monks, Michael.
This might, I hope this doesn't sound wretchedly topical, but I couldn't help it when I was when we were dwelling on 36 to think of how abysmally people have mistaken Vladimir Putin by simply thinking of him as the strategist, and how everyone seems to have, a lot of scholars who spent a lot of time over the last, not just the last 8 years, but prior to that, thinking about Putin, really got him wrong in this recent exercise. I can't use the word war if I want to travel to Russia, so I'll use the official word, this police action. And it's funny, there's something, there is a kind of, it suggests that the natural hatred that is a good thing. I mean, it's kind of the idea that, Milton's idea that reason God made right. So that, and that means that we have a kind of natural hatred for things that aren't right. But that makes us susceptible when we fumble about with our moral faculty and things go a little wrong. It makes us more susceptible, more profoundly susceptible to a hatred which isn't a proper hatred. And of course, the consequences are rather being projected onto bewilderingly. onto this action of Putin's, because the gloves have really come off. I mean, we saw the same thing, of course, in Syria, but it's even more bewildering in this case. And maybe it's, you know, I hesitate to psychoanalyze someone as complicated as Putin, and that's not what I'm doing. I'm just suggesting that he's certainly not being merely a strategist in his aspirations for Ukraine, or simply trying to, I think it would be trivializing to think he's simply trying to secure his legacy. I think when people think in these terms, they really are being conspicuously trite.
Yeah, I'm going to have to run, unfortunately, but Michael, your point, I think a lot of it stems from if you deny the pervasiveness of evil and try to reduce it to a series of critical path, rational decisions, not much of life makes much sense outside of a faculty meeting. But
yeah,
and frankly, having been on the board of a couple of university boards, even in faculty meetings. so.
Not evil, but little demons running all over the place.
Yeah, exactly.
Really scrawny demons.
This is really the amoral imagination of seemingly all bureaucrats today. At least Putin is not merely a bureaucrat. We can say that for him. He seems to be kind of like one, but he's more interesting than that.
Yeah.
Well, we are past 2 hours. Why don't we wind down? Thank you all very much. Next time, of course, the 3rd century on various texts. All right. Until then.
I hope I can join you. It's the week of my daughter's wedding, and as father of the bride, I might have a